French moralist Joseph Joubert once said that monuments are the grappling irons that bind one generation to another. And this quote has become a lifelong testament for Alabama woman Chandalise Duster, who shared her story this past week. Growing up as a young African American, she never could forget the racism accepted by and perpetuated by her city's beloved monuments. It becomes more than simply respecting history when the imprints on her 5-year-old mind last, of her and her mother being harassed by Confederate flag-toting white men for merely picking up groceries. As a young girl in her town city square, she gazed upon the glistening bronze statue of a Confederate hero who fought for her ancestors' oppression to his dying breath. All of this burden before her 6th birthday because of the glamour of the infamous Confederate figures. It is because we believe that the Confederate memorials facilitate racial tensions, and because the United States needs to de-glamorize infamy, that we are proud to propose the motion that this House would remove all memorials to the Confederacy. In this speech, I will be covering 2 main arguments. First, the reality of glamorization and the origins of these memorials. And secondly, the impacts of removing these memorials on both a U.S. and a world level. As for definitions, we would only like to define memorials as a statue, building, or a place of interest that was made after a historical event to commemorate a historical figure. Memorials exclude sites of history. In addition, our first observation acknowledges that the removal of these memorials will not correct any past or current racial injustices all on its own. However, secondly, we must understand that it does counteract the glamorization of the ideologies in the first place by the original oppressors. In addition, we would also like to place a burden on the opposition to prove to us that positive impacts of these memorials even exist, because we as proposition will prove how their very existence perpetuates oppression. Now going on to our very first argument, which is the reality of glamorization. And for our first layer of analysis, we need to dive into the malicious origins of these memorials. The Civil War is the most written about historical event in history, and for 2 reasons. First, the Civil War was very politically charged. But secondly, and most importantly, when the Confederacy lost, they launched a nationwide propaganda scheme that is known as the Lost Cause ideology. This is one that morally stands up for the Confederate cause and causes it to be remembered even today. This ideology was spread through the first Coca-Cola ads, through songs, Jim Crow cartoons, and blackface. Lost Cause ideology was glorified as heritage and was used to further divide American citizens. The impact is people still believing that the Confederacy was justified. 15 years after the Confederacy lost, people's memorialization of this racist ideology permeates into society through these monuments. In 2017, NPR associated the erection of Confederate monuments with the goal of oppressing African American communities. Statues were put up when African American men got the right to vote. Plaques were put up during the Civil Rights Movement. Here, there, and everywhere, as the African American community fought to gain ground, their oppressors erected statues to remind them who was in charge. At its core, these memorials that stand today stand for oppression. It's time to take them down. Chandalise, at 5, remembers looking up at these bronze statues and feeling fear, and that's because it was their intended purpose. And this brings me to our second layer of analysis, which is what true acknowledgement is. Fundamentally, these memorials do not stand for education, for they do not bring light to truly tragic history. To properly address and acknowledge history, glamorization must be taken down and reality must be revealed. Kathy Hay, a historical costumer, embarked down this path of acknowledgement with the peacock dress, which was worn by Baroness Curzon of the Kenilworth at the Second Dell Durbar in 1903. However, after researching and learning that the dress was a symbol for British imperialism over India, she reconsidered the project and asked her audience for their opinion. She did not disregard the true history and blindly glamorize and love the dress. She accepted her people's history as a citizen of the UK and engaged in the hard conversation with dignity. She de-glamorized infamy. Similarly, let's turn our attention to Germany. The only monuments that Germany erects and maintains are those that educate on the Jewish victims and of xenophobic ideology. They accept the shame of their dark history and have de-glamorized the race-driven power of the Third Reich. They understand what it means to de-glamorize infamy. And this brings us to our second overall argument, which is the impacts of removal. And this is going to be on both a US and a world level. The first layer of analysis is that overall, taking down these memorials fights something called the comparison bias. So, have you ever found yourself quarreling with racists who say they aren't racist just because they didn't own slaves or because they didn't do something worse than X, Y, or Z? This idea is called the comparison bias, where one can compare themselves to something worse to prove that they are fundamentally good. In the case of memorials, these stand for the origins of racism within the United States, as I just said, but they also serve as a figure to compare to. More or less, when taking down these statues, we are taking down a way to measure progression, but this is actually very good. Instead of seeing where we as a society have come since slavery, we can turn our focus on what still needs to be accomplished. Because the fact of the matter is that remembering where we came from is actually distracting from further progression in society. This year has sparked a massive movement for more progression towards an equalized society and justice system. And this is not only in the US, but the entire world. Taking those first steps into the future has lasting impacts, and it starts by ending this comparison to the past. Our second layer of analysis is that villains are no longer glamorized. Let's take the impacts of deglamorizing infamy not on a US level, but on a world level. These Confederate figures were also villains of the world, as they stood inadvertently for the torture of the Middle Passage and the destructive nature of imperializing Africa. Taking down these statues is not only a step into properly understanding the history of the United States, but also understanding the dark impacts that the United States has had on the world. It is time to step down from the pedestal, and it's time for romanticization of racists to be gone with the wind. And finally, we can see that overall we would be defogging education by taking down these memorials. Similarly to Chandeliers, I had experiences with memorials, but within my education system. When I lived in Georgia, I was taught about slavery, but not about its extremity. And at my town's courthouse, a Daughters of the Confederacy statue stood tall, commemorating Confederate soldiers from my county. Dauntingly, a few miles east, there stood a plantation house where the teeth of slaves were embedded into handmade bricks. This is the history of slavery, yet it is overshadowed by these statues. Removing the monuments removes these shadows and allows the real history to be brought to life. It is hard history, but everyone will be bettered by its acceptance. When analyzing the origins of these monuments, their failure to educate, and the impacts that come with their destruction, there's no better choice than their removal. Deglamorizing infamy is the first steps to erasing the experiences like that of Chandeliers for future generations, and they are the first steps to a more educated and broadened future. Thank you.